Hello. So in keeping with our discussion of very famous pilot trainers for World War II pilots, I'd like to show and introduce you to the famous J3 Cub or Piper J3 Cub. J3 Cub was built in Lock Haven, Pennsylvania, but was eventually bought by the Piper Corporation. And as you can see, it's probably one of the most distinctive light aircraft ever built. And I'm kind of thinking Piper must have had a sense of humor because he painted this lightning bolt decal on the side of all his yellow Cubs. And I can tell you right now that the Cub was anything but lightning fast. So he must have had a sense of humor when he was painting that decal on this airplane. You'll notice a couple of things right off the bat. It's a tail dragger, which means the main gear are in the front and there's a tail gear in the back. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. It's a metal airframe with fabric covering, so it's a very light airplane. Piper built about 15,000 of these airplanes between 1937 and 1946. So in about a 10-year run, they built about 15,000 of these. They were originally a civilian trainer, but when it looked like that the United States would get involved in World War II, the military started to purchase some of those for training their pilots. It was said that 80% of all military-trained pilots for the United States got their first primary training in a Piper Cub. And you can see why. It's a very basic airplane: stick, rudder, throttle, all the basic things you need to know about aviating an airplane you can learn in a Cub. The reason that so many of them still exist today is that they were cheap to build, cheap to fly, and cheap to maintain back then. They still remain one of the cheapest airplanes to fly and maintain, which is why they've become so popular. And again, you can park a Cub next to an F-16 and you will still get people gathered around the Cub. It just has that kind of aura. In terms of learning to fly, you'll notice it's a tandem. So the instructor would sit in the front seat and the student would sit in the back seat. In this particular Cub, you had to actually solo this airplane from the back. So you felt like you were kind of flying in a bit of a tunnel because the window was out in front and there wasn't much on the side, and so the visibility was not great. Another challenge for pilots just learning how to fly. I will also share another anecdote with you. I actually learned to fly in a Piper Cub because I really wanted the challenge of learning to fly in a tail dragger. And in this particular case, most of the Cubs did not have an electrical system. Okay, so feature this. You had to actually tie the airplane down, stand in front of the airplane, and hand crank the prop. And once it started, you were hoping that you had tied down the airplane correctly, because if you didn't, you would be run over by the airplane. So now you got the engine running. You have to run around, throttle back to idle. Then you have to walk to the back of the airplane, untie the tail wheel, which you had tied up so that it wouldn't run away on you, get back into the airplane, put your heels on the heel brakes, and release the one shock that you had on the right wheel. It was quite an acrobatic maneuver to try to get a Cub started. And once again, you have to learn basic aviating, and this was one way to do it. So now you're flying in your Cub. You're only doing about 65 miles per hour. You're not going very high. You're not going very fast. Now it's time to land. Well, the Cub weighed empty about 800 pounds, which isn't very much. Maybe 1,200 pounds fully loaded with people and fuel. So you can imagine that this Cub was kind of like flying a kite. It was definitely susceptible to anything the wind was doing. So trying to land one of these tail-dragging Cubs in a crosswind was always a challenge, and it made you a better pilot because you had to deal with wind trying to push you off the center line of the runway, get back to the center line, try to get that plane straightened out so that it would hit the ground in a full stall and that tail wheel wouldn't flip around on you in what they call a ground loop. So if you could land a Piper Cub, you could probably land anything. From the very beginning of starting the engine to tying that plane down in the end, you were learning really important things about aviation. So I hope you enjoyed learning something about this plane that trained 80% of the pilots that actually flew in the military in World War II. Thank you.